We are really pleased to have one of Yale's newest faculty members, Dr. Elizabeth Yankovsky, here with us this week to wrap everything up. Dr. Yankovsky received her PhD in atmospheric and oceanic sciences from Princeton University, where she developed expertise in physical oceanography, geophysical fluid dynamics, and ocean modeling at the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory, where she studied turbulent mixing processes in the Arctic Ocean. Following her doctoral program, Dr. Yankovsky was a postdoctoral researcher at NYU from 2020 to 2023, where she joined the Ocean Transport and Eddy Energy Climate Process Team, a multi-institutional project funded by NOAA in the NSF. There, she helped improve the physical understanding and model representation of ocean eddies. And before she joined the ranks of Yale faculty in July of 2024, she worked at the nonprofit startup Seaworthy for a year, where she helped to develop the scientific knowledge and software to support the emerging marine CDR industry. We're super excited to have her here today. So with all that, please help me welcome her.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm really excited to be here and tell you about some of my research and thoughts on ocean modeling. So to give you a little bit of an overview of the goals of my talk today and what I hope that you all will take away. So first, I'll begin by discussing why and how do we study Earth's oceans and also the broad climate system. So even though my focus is really on ocean dynamics, ocean modeling, I'll be kind of beginning by speaking about climate modeling and the climate system more generally, because really the ocean is part of this larger system, and it's very much interrelated with all the other constituents, such as the atmosphere, biosphere, lithosphere, et cetera. So then I'll speak about modeling, what it is and how it has evolved over time, going back to some of the really foundational developments in computer science that happened in the 50s and 60s. I'll speak about then ocean modeling more specifically, talking about some of the benefits, some of the utility in ocean modeling, how it can help us solve a lot of fundamental physical problems. Also, I'll speak about some of the challenges, future directions, and dilemmas that scientists face in this field. And finally, I'll speak about a really exciting application of ocean modeling that I've been thinking about a lot in the last 2 years, which is the marine carbon dioxide removal space. So I want to start by speaking about what makes planetary dynamics unique. This is really kind of the fundamental processes that we're going to be modeling and speaking about today. So these are many examples of flows that we see in the Earth system, ranging from very small scale instabilities, such as this Kelvin-Helmholtz instability that we see in this video here, to various types of convection that we see on Earth, such as convection in the mantle, to various interactions between ice and oceans, vortices, kind of all of these different fluid flows. Two of really the unifying aspects that are very similar across all of these different scales and systems are the fact that we are on a rotating body. So rotation plays a very important role in planetary dynamics, and also stratification. So this idea of layering that we see in many of these systems. There are a lot of challenges across all of these different scales and across all of these different phenomena that I'll be speaking a little bit about today, but just to kind of set the stage, really what differentiates fluid dynamics in the planetary space is this presence of rotation, being on a spherical body, and also these really interesting effects that we get from the layering and the stratification that we see in various settings on Earth. So I want to speak a little bit about why the larger scale motivation of why we study climate and how the ocean fits into all of this. So we know that the climate system is comprised of various constituents. These include the biosphere, the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, all of the liquid components, the lithosphere, so the solid Earth, and also the cryosphere, which is the ice component. And so all of these are really interacting with each other across many different scales to shape how our climate evolves, both in the present, but also in the past and in the future. And so if we want to really understand the Earth system and how it's evolving over time, we really have to look at all of these constituents, how they interplay with each other, and gain kind of mechanistic understanding of how they operate. Another really important reason why we study climate, of course, is because the climate changes, and some of these changes are really fundamental to influencing how humans may survive on this planet in the future. So this is a famous curve known as the Keeling curve, which shows carbon dioxide concentrations at the Mauna Loa Observatory, dating back to the 1950s all the way through 2025. You can see that there's a strong upward trend in the amount of CO2 that we have in the atmosphere. We can also compare this to some of the past CO2 concentrations that we can infer from ice cores and other proxies dating back to more than 400,000 years ago. And we see that there are natural fluctuations in the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, but these are all kind of in the range of about 180 to 280 or 300 parts per million. So we can really view the last couple of decades as a very interesting perturbation onto the climate system, and how the climate system will respond in terms of global temperatures and many other feedback processes is a really interesting problem, and it's a very complex problem. Another very important aspect for why climate science and ocean science is important is to be able to do weather forecasting. This is similar to climate forecasting, but of course it's on a shorter time scale. So it really contributes to our ability to be able to predict storm events and other weather patterns throughout the world. Of course, there are also many socioeconomic implications and natural hazards that we can better understand through kind of having a cohesive understanding of the climate and all of the constituents of the climate. This is particularly relevant for some of the stories that we see in the news these days. And kind of not to take away from just the intellectual challenge and beauty of all of this. We are all kind of living on this planet, and can be really inspiring to kind of go outside, see what's around us, and be able to develop unifying laws to really understand different patterns and different phenomena that we observe on different scales. So this is just showing kind of a picture of a fractal geometry. The last kind of point that I'll be discussing a little bit today is this idea of climate change mitigation. So in order to have safe and effective climate change mitigation strategies, we really need to understand the fundamental dynamics of how the climate system works and how all of these constituents of the climate system interact with each other. So this is an example of something called ocean alkalinity enhancement, which I'll be returning to later in the talk. But the idea is that we can take up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere by enhancing the alkalinity of the surface ocean to store carbon permanently in the ocean. So why is studying the ocean and climate system such a challenge? The main reason that I would argue is that there's a very large breadth of scales, both temporally and spatially, that we have to understand in order to have effective predictions of the climate. So you might have heard of the butterfly effect, where it's kind of this idea of chaos, where we have a butterfly flapping its wings in one part of the globe. This is occurring on scales of millimeters, seconds, kind of very much in this lower left part of this space. So that butterfly flapping its wings then kind of may lead to a hurricane forming somewhere else in the ocean. So it's kind of a cool visualization of the fact that in the ocean and in the climate, there are a lot of nonlinear interactions, meaning whatever happens at one scale is going to affect the larger scale dynamics over time. And the way this happens is quite complex, and it's quite hard to really deeply understand with one particular tool or one particular theoretical framework. So in the ocean, we have the same problem. So when we think about ocean dynamics on the very small scale, we have processes like bubbles and capillary waves evolving on the surface of the ocean, which might lead to very interesting air-sea gas exchange processes. So these are very, very small scale phenomena. If we then move to larger scales, we think about things like tsunamis, mesoscale eddies. So this is something that I've spent a lot of time studying. It's these swirling patterns that we see throughout the ocean. So these are processes that happen on hundreds of kilometers, sometimes thousands of kilometers, and temporal scales of potentially days, weeks, sometimes even years. We have longer term variability that we see in the ocean, such as these different types of patterns, such as El Nino. So this is kind of an example of two particularly strong El Nino events where we see a large degree of warming in the Pacific Ocean. So a lot of different variability on different spatial and temporal scales. And finally, if we move to kind of the upper right part of this curve, this is the Milankovitch cycles. So there's also these kind of tens of thousands of kilometer scale processes that are operating on the premise of the Earth and the sun's orbit. So we know that the orbital properties of Earth change over time with some sort of periodicity. These orbital properties include the eccentricity of Earth's orbit, the obliquity, and the precession. So these are all just kind of parameters relating to how the Earth is moving around the sun and also rotating and orbiting around its own axis. So basically, to kind of summarize all of this, we have this very large range of spatial and temporal scales in our system. Of course, we also have to take into account that we're just looking at the ocean here, and similar dynamics are operating in the atmosphere and the land and the biological component of the Earth system. So this really large breadth of dynamics is very hard to encapsulate in any sort of cohesive theoretical picture. You can envision, and many scientists do this, basically spending your entire career focusing on one point in this whole schematic. And so trying to combine all of these and create climate predictions and be able to really understand this whole system is a huge challenge. So how do we study the climate system? We can use different approaches, ranging from very theoretical approaches where we write down equations, try to form analytical explanations for some of the things that we observe on our planet. We can also run models. So this is something that I'll be speaking a lot about, where we basically discretize the equations that govern the fluid flow and the evolution of various parts of the climate system on a grid, and then use supercomputers to solve those equations. We can also do laboratory experiments, such as this tank pictured here. This can be a challenge because the typical length scales and spatial scales that we see in the real ocean are very hard to replicate in a tank. But nonetheless, we can still make good progress in understanding some of the behavior of fluid flow in tanks. And of course, there's also the idea of going out to sea and taking direct observations of the ocean there. That can be, of course, logistically challenging and quite expensive. And sometimes the data that you obtain from kind of field work is not as clean as something that you would get in a more controlled setting. So in terms of climate modeling, to kind of get back to this idea of using computers to solve some of these equations to try to think about the evolution of the climate as a function of time, what's actually happening when we run these models is that we write down governing equations. So here I wrote them down for the ocean. These are the Navier-Stokes equations. So we have a momentum equation, mass conservation, energy conservation, et cetera. So we can write all of these physical laws down and then take our whole Earth system. So here we have a globe pictured, and we discretize it into these individual grid cells. And so what we do is that we then solve all of these equations through these grid cells by giving the model some initial condition and then prognosing it over time to see how the system evolves. And so this idea of climate modeling has been really foundational to understanding the climate system overall. And actually, one really exciting piece of information here is that the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2021 went to these three scientists. Suki Manabe in particular was one of the first people to do kind of large-scale climate modeling in the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory in Princeton, where I did my PhD. I actually had a chance to meet him, and even though he's in his 90s, he still kind of comes to work and comes to the lab and shows up to all the student talks. So it's really inspiring to see that. So in terms of how and where these types of models are actually being developed and kind of performed, these are two of the main climate modeling centers in the US. The Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory, a couple photos here. It's a laboratory in the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And they have a lot of different subgroups that are thinking about these various constituents of the climate system and how to link them together and develop predictions both for weather and climate. So these are some examples of the different groups that we have in this GFDL laboratory. There's also a center in Boulder, Colorado. So this is the National Center for Atmospheric Research, or NCAR. It is a federally funded research and development center that's managed by the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research. It has multiple facilities, but this one in Boulder, I also had the opportunity to kind of collaborate with some people there while I was at Seaworthy, and it's a really beautiful space. It was designed by IMK, and they similarly have a lot of different subgroups that are working on these various constituents of the climate system and linking them together. So some of the different groups at NCAR include scientists working on meteorology, climate science, atmospheric chemistry, looking at solar terrestrial interactions, and of course, ocean dynamics and environmental and societal impacts. So there's a lot of really fundamental research being done through these modeling centers, and they're really collaborative, incredible efforts where a lot of scientists are coming together to develop this scientific software and also to develop a lot of knowledge about the dynamics. So I want to take a little bit of a step back and discuss how we got here. So kind of going back to some of the historical developments in the field of using modeling to gain insights into the climate system. So the first person I want to mention here is Lewis Richardson, who's a really remarkable person. He was an English mathematician, physical meteorologist, and also a pacifist, which is really interesting. And he did a lot of foundational work on studying the turbulent motion of fluids, looking at different types of fluid instabilities. He also developed a lot of interesting mathematical theories, including the first description of what later became known as fractal geometries. So he had this famous thought experiment of how long is a coastline. So looking at Great Britain, he first split up the coastline or tried to delineate the coastline using 9 line segments, and then kind of found the corresponding length of the coastline from that, and then increased the amount of line segments to 19 and 48 and then 97. And as you increase the amount of line segments, the coast gets longer and longer. So it's kind of this interesting paradox where if you start to trace every little feature that we see in the coast, it can become infinitely long. So that later became really foundational to fractal theory. And he also applied some of his mathematical ideas to think about wars. As I mentioned, he was a pacifist, and he was really interested in thinking about the theory of wars and how we can use math to gain insights into that. So in terms of the climate modeling aspect, he had this kind of fantasy that he called a weather prediction factory, where he imagined basically this large hall, like a theater. So here it's kind of shown as a little drawing or artistic rendering of his idea. Basically, we have this planet here that's discretized into grid cells. And he wrote that we can imagine a large hall like a theater, except that the circles and galleries go right round through the space usually occupied by the stage. The walls of this chamber are painted to form a map of the globe. From the floor of the pit, a tall pillar rises to half the height of the hall. It carries a large pulpit on its top, and this sits the man in charge of the whole theater. And so his idea is that there's some person here that's overseeing all of these other people doing computations at individual grid cells. So at each grid cell, you kind of have a person trying to do the calculations of how that grid point is evolving in time, and then kind of unifying all of them to continue that calculation forward. So it's a really interesting idea for something in the 1920s, before the advent of any sort of computers that would be able to do this much more efficiently. Another really amazing thing that Richardson did is that he actually attempted to do a weather forecast. So during World War I, he was actually driving an ambulance for an infantry division on the Western Front. And he decided to kind of do that little fantasy experiment that I showed on the previous slide by hand. And so he basically took temperature data from this region in Europe and tried to kind of basically come up with this initial condition of taking temperature at all of these grid boxes and then solving those equations, the governing equations by hand. So it's a bunch of partial differential equations that are all kind of functions of each other evolving in time. So it's really hard to solve them by hand. And it took him 6 weeks to do a single 8-hour forecast by hand for one town in this grid. Unfortunately, it was a huge failure, so he ended up getting a completely nonsensical result. Unfortunately, it was because numerical smoothing of the initial data was done a little bit incorrectly. Some people later in time went back and actually redid his calculations and found that the error came from the initial conditions, but otherwise, like, his calculations are pretty flawless. So it's really remarkable that he really believed in this idea, even though this was many decades before supercomputers really came around and were able to do this for us. He was trying to kind of do this by himself and really believed in this vision. So moving forward in time a little bit to the computer revolution. So this kind of came out partially from World War II. So the first general purpose electronic computer was known as the ENIAC, so the Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer. Was built in 1945, and it was commissioned by the US Army for use in calculating the dynamics of projectiles. The principal designers were John Mauchly and Presper Eckert. And so it was a huge effort. Obviously, there are some photos shown here. So The cost of this to build this back then was about $497,000. So this would equate to $6.9 million today. And this computer was around for about a decade. And during that time, it performed more calculations than all of mankind had done up to that point. So it's really remarkable how powerful these machines can be for being able to do these types of calculations. Unfortunately, after 10 years, it was damaged by a lightning strike, but it is actually preserved in the Smithsonian Institute. They have a computer science division, so you can go look at that if you're interested in the future. So then kind of moving forward, this was really for kind of military purposes, but then we come to John von Neumann, who was a Hungarian-American mathematician, and Jules Charny, who was an American meteorologist and mathematician. And they really were the ones that brought this computer revolution into the climate science field and into kind of the weather prediction realm. So they actually designed their own version of the ENIAC in Princeton. So they were working in the Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton in the 1950s. And they built a machine that was similar to the UPenn ENIAC digital computer. But again, this time the purpose is predicting the weather. One really important component of this computer that they built was that they pioneered this idea of a stored program architecture, which was developed by von Neumann. And this is a cornerstone of modern computing, which allows instructions and data to be stored in the same memory, which very much kind of speeds up and improves the performance of this computer. So just to give you some perspective, the one-day weather forecast times for Richardson doing this by hand was 6 weeks. The ENIAC, the UPenn computer, was able to do this in 24 hours. And this IAS machine, developed by Charny and von Neumann, was able to do this computation in only 5 minutes. So really remarkable. And again, this is still in the 1950s. So we've come a long way even since then. And then in terms of the first forecast successes, so this is another really important pioneer in this field of understanding the climate and understanding the fluid dynamics that drive kind of the climate. So Carl Gustav Rossby, you may have heard of Rossby waves, kind of came from his research. He was a Swedish-American meteorologist, and he was the first to use these kind of fluid dynamic Navier-Stokes equations to study the jet stream. So he identified it and studied its structure. He also found that it creates these waves, which again became known as Rossby waves. He founded meteorological schools, and he also, in 1954, combined these mathematical equations and computational methodology to, for the first time, produce weather forecasts. So he was doing thrice weekly forecasts for the Royal Swedish Air Force at the time. And finally, in the 1960s, this is kind of when the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory was established. So Joe Smagorinsky was the first director of GFDL. And in the 1960s, GFDL scientists were the first ones to develop the first coupled ocean atmosphere general circulation climate model. So that's kind of where the Nobel Prize came about, is using that model to predict how the climate is going to respond to carbon dioxide changes in the atmosphere. And of course, as I mentioned, they won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2021 for this research. And kind of here you can see the description is that it's for the physical modeling of Earth's climate, quantifying variability and reliably predicting global warming. And one other thing to point out here is that this was a really huge accomplishment for the field of climate science, because in the past, climate science was known as climatology. So it was kind of a descriptive science where there were a lot of different observations, a lot of kind of qualitative, sometimes conceptual ideas and thoughts about this. But really, this research kind of helped push this into a really hard quantitative science. And so to win the Nobel Prize in Physics kind of really reinforced this as a really fundamental physical science. So again, to summarize kind of the idea of modeling, the operating principles of modeling are that, one, we know the laws of physics that describe the conservation of momentum, mass, and heat. These come from Newton's laws. Of course, we can also think about, if we're modeling other systems, like just ecological dynamics, we similarly have laws that describe that evolution. So kind of armed with this and the knowledge that we can write down the equations that predict their evolution, subject to knowing their values everywhere on Earth at a particular time. This means knowing the initial conditions. we can then predict the evolution of all of these properties, so momentum, mass, and heat of all the fluid parcels in the atmosphere and in the ocean. But of course, this is a very computationally expensive endeavor. And so we have to make assumptions, and they're called parameterizations of some of the unresolved and small scale processes that we cannot actually capture on the grids of our models. And so just to give you a little bit more perspective on how these models have developed over time. So if we look at the 1970s and even the 1960s, when these first models were being developed, they were really focused on very, very simple systems where we just have some sort of CO2 emission into the atmosphere. We're solving the radiative balance equations for the atmosphere and trying to really understand how that affects the surface temperature. We had a basic parameterization or approximation of rain in there. As we move to the 1980s, we have a more sophisticated land surface. We add ice. Ice can lead to very important feedbacks, particularly in the northern and southern parts of the globe. Clouds. And then by kind of the next coming decades, we added a swamp ocean. So this just is like a one-layer motionless body of water. Moving forward in time, this ocean developed its own circulation. So we added more grid cells in the vertical direction to try to encapsulate the fact that this ocean's moving. Adding aerosols, adding carbon cycle, adding chemistry, and adding interactive vegetation. So all of these things have improved what we're actually able to capture in these models and some of the processes that we can then think about. The other aspect that's important, of course, is the model resolution. So dating back to some of these earlier studies in the 70s and 80s, a typical model resolution that was used for the ocean was about 500 kilometers by 500 kilometers for the horizontal size of these grid cells. And as you can imagine, that's very coarse. There's a lot of interesting stuff that happens on smaller scales, particularly in the atmosphere. It's really hard to obtain convection, for example, when your model grid sizes are so large, because convection happens on much smaller scales. And so you really, even though moving forward through time, we've improved the resolutions substantially. So I would say like the modern state of the art resolution for ocean models is about 25 kilometers in the horizontal. There's still a lot of interesting dynamics that are being missed. And so that kind of relates to this problem of how do we, if we think back to that range of scales that I showed earlier and thinking about how a butterfly flapping its wings is going to impact, the larger scale state. The same thing happens in the ocean and overall in the entire climate system. And we have to think about how to represent those effects of nonlinear interactions between the unresolved scales and the resolved scales. So just to give you another example of a modern state-of-the-art climate model. So this is NCARS, the National Center for Atmospheric Research, the one that's in Colorado. This is an example of their community Earth system model. So you can see that it has a lot of very interesting constituents, ranging from the very basic ones of atmosphere and ocean to very kind of complex components, including parameterizations for the surface waves, for river runoff, for land biogeochemistry, for atmospheric chemistry in various parts of the atmosphere, sea ice, and even land ice. And so all of these constituents, we're solving equations for all of these systems and linking them together to form a more cohesive model for how our climate is evolving in time. And just to give you a little bit more intuition, so this is an example of some of the land components. You can see that some of the scientists working here have thought a lot about how to incorporate some of these really intricate kind of patterns that we might see in terms of what the vegetation and soil and land cover looks like. So even down to thinking about different types of trees and how we can incorporate that variability into grid cells. And I know this is a little blurry, but just to give you kind of an overview, there's a lot of different processes that are included in these land models, including biogeochemical cycles, hydrology, surface energy fluxes, and then maybe even starting to think about human-induced effects as well. And then something that's a little bit more relevant to some of my research is the ocean biogeochemistry component. So this is the piece of this model that's solving for some of the interesting dynamics that we see in the biological cycles in the ocean. So this model is called CESM Marble, and you can see that it's representing these various species ranging from small phytoplankton to larger things like mesozooplankton. These organisms have a really fundamental impact on the carbon cycle and can be very important to think about modeling them as we're doing these climate change projections into the future. And there's even development of including fish, so different trophic levels and predation into these models. So all of this goes to say that this is very computationally expensive to try to capture all these equations to include things like fish and different types of land, different interactions among all of this. And so the question is like, how far can we get by just using more computing resources and developing our computers to be able to handle larger computations? So of course, now we have a lot of really incredible developments that are happening that are allowing us really amazing resources and abilities to predict very large sets of equations. This is showing an example of a weather prediction model. So you can see that here, if we're running this for a very short amount of time, we can actually afford resolutions that are resolving even like individual cloud formations. But of course, when we're thinking about longer term predictions, so if we want to run these models for, say, hundreds of years, we really cannot afford to run them at such high resolutions. And so that's kind of where we need to think about how to parameterize all of this. I do want to mention this idea of Moore's law. It's not really a law, it's just an observation. It was first kind of put forth by Gordon Moore, who was one of the Intel co-founders in 1965. He was observing that the amount of transistors and microchips were doubling every 2 years. So that meant that there was an exponential growth in the amount of computations that we could do. Interestingly, this observation actually held up for many decades after kind of the initial regime that he thought it would apply over. You can see that it basically held up almost to the 2010s, at which point we start to see a flattening off of this curve, just because modern transistors are getting close to being near atomic scales, so there's not really much space to make them even smaller. But of course, this meant that over all of these decades, the amount of calculations that we're able to do per second per $1,000 has also substantially increased over time. Even though it might be flattening out, there potentially are other technological developments that could help us to do more computations in the future, such as quantum computing. And of course, this also goes hand in hand with the historical price of computer memory and storage also decreasing over time. And again, flattening off a little bit in the last few years. But the combination of all of this is really what drove a lot of those trends that I showed earlier of all of these climate models becoming much higher in resolution and also becoming much more complex in terms of the different processes that they're capturing. But that doesn't mean that we still can just rely on computational resources becoming more accessible and more available in the future. So one thing that I've thought a lot about is from kind of the model development perspective is how to develop parameterizations. So again, the idea of this is that if we have a coarse model, it's not resolving a lot of the interesting processes and dynamics. And so we can artificially try to nudge it into behaving like a higher resolution model. And in order to do this, you really have to understand the fundamental physics of the problem and of the dynamics that you're trying to replicate in the coarse model. So in this case, I've been thinking a lot about eddies in the ocean. And so just to give you a little bit of a brief aside into some of my work in this space, this is showing a couple of different resolutions of models. So this is a very high resolution model that has a 3-kilometer grid size. You can see it's not the whole ocean, not the whole climate. It's just a little box that represents the Atlantic Ocean. You can see that the kinetic energy, or kind of how rapidly the flow is moving, is very different between this high resolution case and a coarser model. So through kind of really studying the physics of how these eddies inject energy into the ocean and how they evolve, I was able to develop this parameterization that really mimics the behavior of this high resolution case in a much coarser grid. So this is a 50-kilometer grid, so the same as these two. But you can see that if we kind of think about the physics and think about how to improve these coarse models, we can definitely do so. But it does require a lot of process understanding of the various phenomena that go into these dynamics. Okay, so now I want to shift a little bit into applications of how we use ocean climate models. So we've spoken a lot about the historical development of these models and some of the capabilities of these models in the present day. So the various types of phenomena that they're able to look at, the land and the ocean and the biological component of the Earth system. So in terms of how we use them, we do use them a lot for prediction on various scales, spatially and temporally. So weather prediction is an example, climate projection is another example, studying regional patterns, so how climate in regional areas might change over time. Another thing that we can use these models for is for sensitivity studies to better understand the Earth system. So I mentioned kind of looking at eddy dynamics. So we can similarly ask a lot of interesting science questions, some of which are more curiosity driven, maybe not immediately practical, but I personally think that a lot of these curiosity driven questions do end up often having a great deal of practical applications. Some examples of things that people have thought about are what happens without a Gulf Stream? How does the overturning circulation in the ocean change? How does that affect the climate? What happens if the Drake Passage is closed? So that's a channel in the Southern Ocean. And there is evidence that as the continents move around, that can really lead to big shifts in the climate state. And so the Drake Passage closing is one example of that can really affect how the ocean circulation looks like and how heat is redistributed and moved around over the globe. The role of eddies and turbulence and kind of moving around energy, information, heat, carbon, all of these things. And also looking at biogeochemical cycles and potentially looking at how human behavior is impacting all of these processes. So the other really interesting application that I've been thinking a lot about recently is the idea of climate change mitigation, and in particular, how to durably remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and store that. And so in this movie, this is showing a 1/10 of a degree climate model. So this is that same CESM that I mentioned earlier with the biogeochemistry model, MARBLE. Here, what's being shown is the air-sea CO2 flux as a movie over the entire globe. You can see that there are places where CO2 is coming out of the ocean and places where CO2 is coming into the ocean. And there's a lot of really interesting variability. We know that the ocean actually takes up a great deal of carbon dioxide. And so one of the questions in climate change mitigation is, can we accelerate or speed up this natural process of carbon dioxide uptake by the ocean? And so to go a little bit into more detail on that, we know that the ocean absorbs about 25% of annual emissions and is also the largest carbon reservoir in the Earth system. So we know that we're emitting, as I showed in the Keeling curve, significant amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and that's causing the CO2 in the atmosphere to increase over time. In terms of where that is stored, about 25% of it is stored in the land biosphere and 25% in the ocean. But the really interesting piece of this is that the ocean is actually has a much larger carbon inventory to begin with. So it's about 38,000 petagrams of carbon compared to much smaller amounts of carbon in vegetation and soils and in the atmosphere. And so as a result, a lot of scientists are thinking about the ocean being a potentially very highly scalable place to store additional CO2. So just to give you a little bit of a brief introduction to ocean alkalinity enhancement. You don't need to understand all the stuff that's on the slide. It's kind of like a textbook snapshot. But the idea is that there's natural weathering that's happening in the Earth. So through kind of the weathering of rocks. So here I showed famous rock in near Vegas and Red Rocks. And the process of weathering rocks takes a really long time. So millions of years for these rocks to break up into smaller and smaller pieces and eventually get washed into the ocean. But when this happens, in general, when the climate is warmer, the hydrological cycle tends to be stronger. And so this weathering process tends to happen in a more accelerated way. What this weathering process does is that it washes all of these rock fragments, which are kind of a source of natural alkalinity, into the ocean. And what alkalinity does is that it shifts this kind of equilibrium of CO2 and being dissolved in water to the right, which allows the ocean to take up more CO2 through ingassing. And so the idea is that as we add alkalinity, we take up more CO2, which then cools the planet. The hydrological cycle then weakens, and this feedback cycle continues to operate naturally. The idea of kind of doing this as a human climate mitigation strategy is to artificially supply the alkalinity to the surface of the ocean, and then hope that alkalinity stays at the surface so that it can take up carbon dioxide, which can then be permanently stored in the ocean. But of course, this relies on really understanding the ocean dynamics and really understanding the chemistry of this process and its interactions with the biological constituent of the ocean. And so I think that modeling is a really powerful tool that we can leverage here. Just to give you some sense of some of the challenges associated with actually measuring, reporting, and verifying these alkalinity enhancement ideas. This is showing a model simulation of putting alkalinity at the surface off the coast of Africa. And after 1 month, you see that the patch of alkalinity is still localized to the injection site, which is shown in black. This is a figure that was made by Mengyang Zhao, who published this very interesting paper looking at ocean alkalinity enhancement over the entire globe. But you can see that after a year, that patch of alkalinity has already spread pretty far. And by 15 years, it's occupying the entire Atlantic basin for the most part. So this idea of large spatiotemporal scales, kind of going back to some of the things we talked about previously, where there's this very large range of spatial and temporal scales that are relevant for these dynamics, it makes it very challenging to take observations and to have some sort of cohesive picture of what's going on in a global scale. There's also unfavorable signal to noise ratios. So the idea of a lot of these interventions is that they're very small so that they do not disturb any of the ecosystem dynamics and lead to deleterious effects. So as a result, these small signals that we see are actually masked out by that the background CO2 fluxes into and out of the ocean that I showed in the movie on previous slide. And finally, if we just think about the idea of having a baseline to be able to compare against our intervention scenario, we really need some sort of counterfactual to assess this idea of additionality. So what came from our intervention? And so as a result, it's really hard to solve this problem just through observations, and we really kind of need to leverage models here as well. But of course, again, we're kind of going back to this problem of the multi-scale nature of these dynamics, because they're really kind of governed by the dynamics of the atmosphere and the ocean, which, as we talked about, have all of these various scales that are operating in them, ranging from kind of the microscale 3D turbulence space, where the spatial scales are on the order of 10 to the minus third, or even like millimeter scales, all the way to global scales, where we're thinking about things like the Milankovitch cycles and the overall like periodicity of Earth's orbit, tens of thousands of kilometers, and potentially thousands of year timescales. So trying to understand the evolution of a perturbation across all of these scales is a very challenging problem. And even for models, like we can't expect one model to be able to resolve all of these processes. We don't have the computational resources for all of them, and we don't necessarily have all of the information to do that. So what we do is we try to do individual studies where we formulate a model to study a particular scale and then try to link all of those studies together. So as an example of studying the microscale dynamics, this is research that was actually done here at Yale by Mary-Louise Timmermans and Adam Yang, who has now taken a faculty position elsewhere. But the idea here was to assess the effective settling of these mineral particles in the ocean. So the idea here is that, again, we're adding alkalinity to the ocean, but we're thinking about how this alkalinity may be moved out of the surface and no longer lead to carbon dioxide being taken up. So they were studying these really small scale stabilities that might modulate the settling of these various particles that we're adding to the surface. And they actually found that these very small scale shear instabilities that develop at the base of this ocean surface layer really can make an order of magnitude larger transport downwards of these particles. And so that could really, make this idea infeasible of adding these milled particles because they're settling out so quickly. On the more global scale, as I mentioned, the study by Mengyang Zhao, who is now here at Yale. So this was to map the global variation and the efficiency of carbon dioxide removal by ocean alkalinity enhancement. So this was looking at kind of adding alkalinity all over the ocean and seeing how much that alkalinity stays at the surface and how much it actually leads to carbon uptake over all of these different dynamical regimes that we see. But again, the disadvantage here is that our model grid cells here are about 100 kilometers by 100 kilometers in size. So we're missing all of those microscale turbulent dynamics that could really be super important for this process. And just to give you a little bit of an idea of what I'm currently working on is trying to really bridge some of these studies between the really microscale fundamental turbulent dynamics and the global scale. dynamics. So I've really been trying to look at these regional scales. And it turns out that you can also formulate models to solve for specific regions rather than the entire globe, which can be a really powerful tool to actually improve our ability to understand these dynamics. So this is an example of a regional model that I've been running for the coast of California, kind of modeling an alkalinity release off of this coast and looking at how the carbon is taken up. So this is the dissolved inorganic carbon that we see in the water, and this is the air-sea flux of CO2. So these types of studies can help bridge some of these different length scales. Again, it's still challenging because, of course, there are limitations. We're only capturing a small part of the ocean here, even though it's allowing us to have much higher resolution simulations. There are still things that we're missing here as well. And so I've been thinking a lot about how different ocean model resolutions and climate model resolutions might impact the results of some of this verification that we're doing through models. So this is, again, showing a little bit of a comparison between a coarser model and a finer model. It turns out that in the finer model, if we look at how much of that alkalinity is actually staying at the surface, this is showing a ratio of that number. So you can actually see that in the higher resolution case, there's only about 90% of the alkalinity remaining at the surface. In other words, there's more vertical mixing that's being resolved, and that efficiency of the carbon dioxide removal is getting smaller. So this is really interesting to think about. It's obviously a very hard problem, and observations are not enough to be able to quantify and verify some of these climate mitigation strategies. But even with models, there's a lot of different model assumptions and different resolutions that can really lead to different results. And so trying to think about how to unify all of these results across different modeling frameworks and different model resolutions is a really fundamental problem that a lot of us are thinking about now. So I want to end with a summary and a few outstanding questions. So as we discussed, models are complex metaphors for a very complex system. Even though we've experienced a lot of amazing growth in computing and in the development of these models, they still lack many important processes, and they're limited by computation. And we're still dealing with this parameterization problem where even when we move to very high resolution models, we're still missing important physics. And so there's a lot of interesting thought on how we should make progress here. Should we add better parameterizations, try to really improve the representation of these processes that are not resolved on the grid scale of our model? Should we add more components, perhaps maybe more complex biological models or ecological models, or incorporating economic or human feedback activity into these models? So kind of a lot of different avenues by which we can make progress there. But of course, you can also argue that maybe adding more components which are poorly constrained is also not a great idea. So this is something as a modeler that you're often asked, which is how do we tell which models, if any, to believe? We know that there are differences between resolutions. There are differences based on parameterizations that we choose. Some of these parameterizations have constants or kind of empirically derived numbers that might not be very accurate. And so how do we know what of this to believe, and how does this project onto some of the practical applications? Such as kind of quantifying climate mitigation efforts and geoengineering through measurement, reporting, and verification. I do believe that there are a lot of really brilliant people working in this field, and it's quite inspiring that a lot of these accomplishments are being recognized, such as through this Nobel Prize in Physics. So I think there's definitely a lot of optimism to be had here, but nonetheless, it's a very challenging problem just due to the really multi-scale nature of it. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take questions.
All right, we have time for a couple of questions.
Hi, yeah, I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit more maybe to that last question. I was just kind of wondering a little bit more about what are the verification processes for some of these models. I'm not a modeler, so I don't really know that much about this, to be honest. So yeah, if you could just speak a little bit more to what you think the answers might be for how we tell which ones we believe.
Yeah, that's a great question. So in the last couple of decades, there's been a lot of data that through remote sensing we can obtain about the Earth system. Satellites have played a huge role in that, particularly for the ocean. So being able to see how the currents look like from a satellite perspective and even get temperature salinity measurements of the ocean remotely allows us to do what's called data assimilation into some of these models. So try to kind of nudge them to values that we actually observe on a global scale. So that I think that helps a lot, and just kind of individual point measurements as well can be used to better understand how models are performing in specific regions and try to incorporate actual observations into improving their performance. In general, a lot of times when these climate models are run, there are different metrics that scientists try to make sure that the model is getting right. And so sometimes they tune these models to get those metrics correct. The Gulf Stream is one example. So trying to make sure it's detaching from the North American coast in the right place, thinking about the transport and the Antarctic circumpolar current. So in terms of tuning the models, there are some metrics that modelers really try to make sure are being correctly represented. But that's a great question of broadly, how do we make sure all these different constituents are being properly accounted for?
Thank you. I was wondering if recently, maybe in like literature and stuff, you're seeing using more advanced computational methods or bigger computers for improving the parameterization of existing models is making better predictions, or it's actually adding newer, higher resolution data is driving better predictions in developing of new models.
So the question is like whether it's more of the data or the characterizations. Yeah, I would say it's a combination of both. It really depends on the specific constituent that you're looking at. I personally have worked a lot on parameterizations, and there are a lot of interesting problems that arise. Sometimes you understand the physics of what you're trying to parameterize really well, and then you put it into the climate model, and then the climate model has other biases and other interacting, compensating errors that people have tuned it to work. But when you actually add the better physics in it, it starts to perform more poorly. So then you have to investigate, why is that happening? So I think as an easy answer, maybe observations are the more direct way to improve this. But I think kind of long term, it's really important to get the numerics and all the actual physical equations to be correct. But that's a more kind of complicated process a lot of times.
I have a much more broad question. Just speaking about like funding for this research and stuff. I know you mentioned a lot of it is federally funded. Is that something that is potentially getting cut, or like, are you concerned about that? I'm just curious kind of what the landscape looks like for the future of this modeling, particularly in the, the coming years.
Yeah, I would definitely say that it's a concern. So I spoke a lot about the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory. I know they just kind of fired several people that work there, and some of the more senior kind of model developers that have been there for decades, like they're thinking about either retiring early or really concerned about their jobs, which is extremely sad, I think. I definitely am very worried about the future of climate modeling. And it's a really fundamental piece of science that I definitely think we need, regardless of political views. So it's definitely a worry that I have. Yeah.
All right. Any others? It's okay to end early. Oh, okay. We have one more.
Hi, thank you so much for this presentation. It's so amazing to see more ocean voices being represented at YSE and in this series. My question is a little bit, I know I came in a little bit through your talk, so apologies if this was mentioned, but I was hoping you could go a little more into how to expose people who might not come from a science background or might struggle to understand kind of the finer like physics and chemistry that go into these models, how to get people to see them, and then once they see them, get them to understand them.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll just go back to one of my slides. So I think having this historical perspective of, sorry, let me escape. Actually, I did not share this slide, but I think this is also quite interesting. Just kind of going back to some of the historical developments in climate science, I think can be really illuminating. If we go back to the 1800s, we were really missing a lot of things that we take for granted now, like understanding infrared radiation and how carbon dioxide absorbs infrared radiation, for example. So I think kind of maybe showing students that back in the 1800s, we were doing these very basic experiments where we had, for example, a tube with carbon dioxide, and we were shining light into it and shining radiation into it and seeing how that was changing some of the absorption and what that means for the atmosphere. So a lot of these early models were very simple. You can think even of a one-layer atmosphere that's fully homogeneous. And even there, you can already see a lot of these more complex dynamics evolving. So I think having kind of a historical perspective and just explaining in basic terms, like what is the greenhouse effect? How does that come about? And having students develop intuition for that is where I would personally start. I've been actually teaching this course kind of looking at these historical papers from the 1800s, and it's been really interesting because a lot of the students in the course don't have a science background, but nonetheless, like they've been making a lot of progress and kind of building over time this understanding of how all of these pieces of the climate interact with each other.
All right, and we'll call it there because it looks like we have an exam coming in. So wish them luck. All right, thanks, guys.